Welcome to the Success is Subjective podcast series brought to you by collegealternative.org, presented by Lilly Consulting. I'm your host, Joanna Lilly. In today's episode, I had the pleasure of interviewing Chris Kirby. Chris is a recovery advocate who directs the outreach and admissions department for Thrive Treatment and The Last House. Now, Chris graduated The Last House in 2014 and has an intimate relationship with most recovery programs. He's worked in direct client care as a counselor and in facility management. Chris brings a wealth of knowledge in motivating clients and loved ones to engage in treatment. He provides education to medical and clinical professionals on methodologies to treat the growing drug-addicted millennial and Gen Z populations. He is a trained interventionist and serves on the board of Project U-Turn, which helps families access interventions. In his free time, Chris is an avid surfer and fly fisherman. He believes strongly using the power of nature to aid the healing and recovery process. He can often be found at the beaches close to home and around the world riding waves. He often draws parallels between riding the ocean waves and the waves of life and emotions in recovery. So let's not wait any longer. Here's Chris Kirby. All right, Chris Kirby. I'm super excited to finally have cornered you to do this podcast interview.
I'm super excited to be on it.
Hey.
I've just heard some of your past guests. It's so helpful.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm super excited for you to tell your story so that it can be helpful for other people to listen to in the future. So I feel like I've heard some of your story, or at least like parts of it, over the years that we've known each other. So for the listeners that maybe don't know you at all, why don't you start with telling us, where did you grow up? And then kind of, here's like the twofold. What were you hearing from your family about post-secondary education or higher education? And then kind of similar to the first part of where you were raised, what culturally was the community in which you were raised saying about higher ed?
Absolutely. I was raised in a little town called Orinda outside of the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a very affluent community, very small community, and my family had been there for years. And the messaging in this community, and preparing for this, I knew you were going to ask these questions. And so I started asking myself these questions about, because I have the story I tell myself about where I grew up and how I grew up. And I've really been kind of dissecting it, knowing that we were going to be sitting down and having this chat. And, my family, so I'm the first in my family to ever go to college. And, my family's from this very affluent community, but they're long-standing in this community where my name meant something. My last name meant something in this community because of my ancestors there. And, even though my parents had never gone to college, it was really important to them that I went to college. And I was asking myself why that was, especially since they were successful and they never went to college. And I remember being in high school, looking at choosing colleges because my mom wanted me to go to school so badly. And it wasn't at the time, and even, looking back on it, it wasn't so much pressure from my family about going to a university. And not going to a community college, too, was important. It was going to a 4-year university. And it was just, that's what you did. There was no alternative in my community. My high school had a 99% graduation rate. And most of, my class went to really prestigious schools. And so there was really just never any other option presented to me. Where it was just like, what do you do when you graduate high school? You go to college. Why? Because that's just what you do. And I remember choosing my university, and I was a water polo player, and that was a big deal in the town where I came from. And so I wanted to play water polo. And then by this time I had been smoking weed, and I had a cannabis club card, and the requirement was to stay in California. So I could use my cannabis club card, and I was telling the story last night to somebody who was also a swimmer and went to a different university. And I was like, yeah, that took Bucknell off the table for me.
Interesting. Okay, so really your choice then for where you went to school was in part because of this cannabis card.
Mm-hmm.
And also because you want at least, okay, if I'm going to go to school, at least let me do something that I enjoy doing, right? The water polo, even though mom's saying go to school, go to school. So you're trying to like kind of find a place that checks all the boxes. So you went somewhere. I know that part of your story. You don't have to say
I
exactly.
went to Whittier College
Okay.
in East Los Angeles. The Purple Poets. They make the ESPN Top 40 Worst Mascots every year. We wore purple Speedos, and we took a lot of pride in it. We did. And there was never any thought to major or, what I would do with an education. And the town I grew up in was, the expectation was that because I was good at water polo and all my friends' parents and families were successful, and I had this, and I had been raised with an unknowing sense of entitlement, where because people knew my family, wherever I went, I was instantly respected, and I got away with a lot in high school. I got away with a lot just because I was a good athlete and everybody knew my family.
So let's take it a different direction. So you end up going to Whittier, and there is the piece a lot about kind of your, like who you are, right? Where you came from, which leads you to being in school. But East Los Angeles is really far from the San Francisco Bay Area. So talk about, aside from purple Speedos, which, if we want to post a photo of Chris circa college in a purple Speedo, maybe we will.
I think my mom has a collection. She'd be happy to contribute.
Or maybe that just needs...
And she was so proud of me then. I just remember my parents being so proud of me, and my dad coming to my, when I would go travel to Northern California on tournaments, I was just so proud that they could come and watch me, be successful. That was really, making people proud was something really important to me.
Mm.
And I know you wanted to take it a different direction. And as I look back on it, is the things that I was, college was also was an intervention in my life in a sorts where it put it on a different direction. Because prior to all through high school, one thing that my family did is they're lifeguards. Going back to, my grandmother was a lifeguard, and I was a lifeguard, and I was really good at it. And we had this kind of proud history of like teaching people how to swim and being of service to the community. And, one thing that was unique about me is that I'm hearing impaired and I wear hearing aids. And, all I really wanted to be a Coast Guard rescue diver. I really wanted to be a firefighter. I wanted to do, and those were the things that being of service to people really made me happy and made me feel fulfilled. And then I went to college, and that was off the table because I couldn't go any farther with that being hearing impaired. And I went to college, and he was like, okay, now you have to pick something, and I'd changed majors a couple of times, and I remember I was listening to your podcast with Zach, and he was talking about, this essentially is, fulfillment of success. And, I never got to look at like, this is what makes me feel happy. And I never felt like I was working when I was lifeguarding. And I had these, innate skills from that, which were crisis management, which were, making people feel safe, which was, to some degree customer service. And now I'm being told I need to pick a major and, do something with it. And it's like, I really liked history, but, you couldn't do anything with history. And everything in my community was, a lot of people work in finance and work in real estate. So I was like, okay, I want to do, I'm going to do commercial real estate. It was what my friend's dad did. And I always assumed that I would just get a job from one of my friend's dads. They would give me an internship. I'd be working at Goldman Sachs. And, I told myself this story, and it all came from this place of entitlement. And when I went to college, my high school was a very good high school. College was easy. Like, I didn't even try, and I got good grades my first year. And then I was like, I don't even really need to go to class. Like, I'm better than this. Again, this entitlement shows up. And the second year, my grades slipped, and I got really depressed. And by this time, what was giving me fulfillment turned into, partying, using, various substances, and just, as somebody who works really well in crisis and likes to be, I'm very physically active. I loved water polo. I loved being in the mix and socializing. That gave me that fulfillment that I'd kind of started to lose. And so I remember, leaving school, and it was like the school's fault. And, for people that are going through this and, doing post-secondary education, there's just so much more latitude, I think, that kids need to have, where I needed to do so many classes in order to maintain my status as an athlete. And I had, there was one class I didn't do well at, and I dropped it. And then, I was able to continue playing, but then I became ineligible. And it really wasn't the school's fault. It was all my fault. But again, being raised, feeling like I was the kid that would walk into a store and the cashier knew my name, and it was like, I remember walking into the assistant dean's office and feeling like, well, don't you know who I am? Like, I'm the number 2 scorer on the water polo team. Like, you're not going to do that. And that was a message that, had been instilled in me to some degree. And I remember feeling they're not treating me like I need to be treated. This place is in, East LA was tough, especially, I live in Los Angeles now. And after leaving school in Los Angeles, I swore I would never move back to LA. And it's just, you need a car to get around everywhere. And I didn't feel like I fit in, and I was getting depressed, and I was starting to, increase my use of drugs, and this kind of amalgamation of entitlement and these expectations I had, because at this point now I need to, I'd been given all these opportunities and kind of passes in life, and now I needed to prove that I earned them, and I needed to prove that I was worthy of all these things, and I wasn't succeeding there, right? And so, in true millennial fashion, I'm going to try something else. This is dumb, and I didn't have the language yet to say, like, I was depressed. I didn't have the language to say I'm using drugs too much. I didn't have the language to say, I just don't feel like other people like me, or I feel vulnerable. All I had the language at that point at 20 years old was, this sucks. This is stupid.
That's such the developing brain. Okay, so you at least are able to articulate this sucks. So you left, right? In entitlement, like carrying you out the door. Well, you're not treating me the way I need to be treated. So what happened after you left LA?
I moved back in with my parents, and I went back. I had the summer job lifeguarding, and I knew I had that immediately. And I had, I'll go to community college and I'll figure it out. And really what happened was I just, fell into this place of, I'd always been kind of a little liar as a kid. And, one thing I look back on is I wish people had called me out on that more. I was, had this great imaginative mind, and I would make things up, and it was really innocent. And so, I was doing a little bit of work, and I had slid back into this place of comfort, right? I had my high school girlfriend. I was living at my parents', and I was, I was smoking, pot every day, and I was starting to use, opiates, and, I'm part of the generation where, the Oxycontin was a really big thing. And so I slid into this place of complete comfort where I wasn't challenging myself. And I remember attending events, even Christmas dinner, everybody's like, "So Chris, what are you doing?" And knowing that all my friends are at college and they're having these successful, experiences, and they're doing internships, and I would make up these, I'm really looking into Haas Business School. I think an MBA is really the way to go for me. And it was just such a disconnect where it was, something that I wanted, but I didn't know how to get there. I didn't know how to struggle because I had just been wrapped in this cocoon of comfort. And, as somebody who is, with addiction and addictive tendencies, as humans, we really try to make sense of it all. Well, why are you a drug addict? Well, why? Well, what caused this? And I talked to, in my job today, I talked to so many parents who are like, what did we do wrong? And for me, I was a neurodiverse case where I really feel like I was born with the brain that I have, and that had addiction, as an illness. And it was just what was going to happen regardless of whether I stayed in school or whether I challenged myself. But that was the age where I really fell into it and became dependent on drugs for, almost as a survival mechanism.
So at what point then, because here you are, there has to be some sort of crux, right? This turning point, because you mentioned earlier you are currently living in LA, or the LA area, you swore up and down, I'll never go back, right? Fill us in where's this crux in your young adult years where you go from you can't be in San Francisco or the Bay Area any longer, right? Like you're kind of teeing it up to, like, at some point shit hit the fan, right? You went to treatment, you had to get sober, but share a little bit of your story and then kind of allow us to follow on your journey of how you getting back to Southern California.
Yeah, well, shit had been hitting the fan for a while.
It was about to really hit the fan.
And that's every time it was about to really hit the fan, I would make some last second move to divert. And oh gosh, I remember the first time my parents confronted me. They were like, "You need to, go to get help, or you got to get out of our house," And they gave me a date. It was August 1st. You're either in treatment or you're out of our house. And sure enough, July 30th, I'm signing up for treatment, getting ready for August 1st. And that was one way I was able to divert that crisis. I remember, and as I went through the increase of, more where it became very clear that I had the disease of addiction and that my brain was completely arrested by it. This one time, I went on a family vacation to Hawaii, and I took the flight out there, and I just didn't take the flight home. Things had been going so bad back home, and I did what people refer to as a geographic, where I just completely changed my environment. And then 9 months later, I'm in trouble in Hawaii, and shit's about to hit the fan. And it was Halloween night, and I hopped on a flight, and I came back to the Bay Area, and I just bounced along the bottom for a while. And my mom and my dad had started really practicing boundaries, and I had some run-ins with the authorities, and it was bad. It was not fun. I was, got to a point where I was homeless. I was going in and out of homeless shelters. I was going in and out of publicly assisted treatment centers where I was going into treatment, and it was, people that had just been discharged from parole. And, it had to get to a point where my only option was to go through, people would say, face my demons. And now I say the only way through it is through it. As young men, we're taught, oh, get over it. Get over it, man. And now I look back and I realize there was no way to get over it. There was only getting through it. And I was put in this position where every other option had been taken away. There was no moving anywhere. There was no, no family support. There was no, and I had to go through something different. I had to get uncomfortable. Because at that point, I'd been living my life seeking comfort, and having my brain having been arrested to that degree, the only comfort I had was using drugs, and that was whether I was homeless, staying in a hotel room, or that was the only comfort I had left, and I had to be removed from comfort. And so I, in a very magical sense, I just really have now just believe in kind of the spirit of the universe. My mom's Al-Anon sponsor's daughter was engaged to this guy who had a program in Los Angeles, and they were down to take me. I remember I called my mom, and it was the first time I didn't have any contingencies on what I was going to do. I said, I will do whatever. Please just set something up for me. I will do whatever it is. And this was the first time there was no, I'll go to treatment, but I need these meds. I will go to treatment, but I need my phone. It was just, I'll do whatever. It wasn't even I'll go to treatment. It was this place of pure desperation of please just help. Help, and I will accept the help that is being offered. And so I went to a really unique program, which is still the program that I work at and now partnered in, and it's something I really believe in. And I was challenged to get uncomfortable. So that was really the crux, I guess, of my life, where I passed this turning point. And, that was when the journey kind of upwards really started for me. And, I just had to get because, I'm smart and entitled. I thought
I wish you could all see his face when he says that. It's just like, it's endearing.
Thank you. My parents didn't think my entitlement was endearing. And especially the other guys at this program I was at didn't think my entitlement was endearing. In fact, they thought it was lame and so not cool. And, as humans, we develop these stage characters that we like to present. And I came fully into this program with my stage character. I just had to let you all know how street I was and the things I did, and how good at surfing I was, and how good at I was really riding the past, Joanna. Like, I was really riding some accomplishments that were years ago. And they were just like, dude, we don't care. Like, do you realize where you are? And I had so many interventions in this program that at the time I was like, again, this is stupid. This sucks. You guys don't know what you're doing, but I had no other options except to do them. And I look back at some of these things that I thought were so wacky, and they absolutely saved my life. They were absolutely, these confrontations and these interventions where my thinking was challenged, and it was so uncomfortable. But I'll tell you what happened was I learned how to be uncomfortable. And, fast forwarding, 9 years is I'm cool with being uncomfortable. Like, I'm totally okay in the uncomfortable, in the awkward. That's just life. And, sometimes I say something real stupid and I just have to sit in silence until the moment passes, and that's okay.
That's honestly probably the best thing that any human can have, is the ability to sit in that place of discomfort. Because if you are uncomfortable at all slightly with that discomfort, now I'm like twisting up my words, if you can't handle the discomfort, then you will fill your life with anything to fill that void and not have that feeling, right? That's why there are so many, why there's such a need for addiction treatment, because honestly that it feels like I'm just rambling. You get the point.
You're absolutely, you bring up a really good point too. And, especially for the parents that are listening to this, I want to let you know it's okay for your kids to be uncomfortable. And, I don't have kids. And so disclosures, I don't really know what it's like to have a kid who's addicted. But what I do see is I see this God-given instinct in parents to want their children to be happy, to be okay, to be healthy, to be successful. And when they are uncomfortable, families parents are, as my parents were very quick to come in and help ease my discomfort. And what, in my experience, and the experience I see with the young men that I work with, is families are mitigating consequences. And consequences in the adolescent brain are really important because we're still testing these boundaries of what's okay and learning how to have an experience with something. See, I could be told, the hot stove analogy, I could be told not to touch the hot stove, as many times as I want. But until I touch that hot stove and get burned, the imprint then in my mind of this is painful and I shouldn't do that becomes real and becomes part of my mind. And, there's probably, doctors and neurologists that could explain this better than I, but just through my experience, that is, very real.
I like that. We need less of the bubble wrapping. I don't want to skip over this because I think this is really important. I think you need to highlight the shameless plug of the program that really saved you, right? Like, I want to know, what are you doing, right? Like, what's your role? And it might even be helpful to say, like, what were probably several of the roles that you held leading up to where you are now.
So in preparing for this, I get to bring it full circle. Remember I told you I was a lifeguard?
Yeah.
And I loved helping kids. I loved, crisis management and crisis intervention. But I never thought I could do that again because of this disability that I have. And, growing up, I never thought I had a disability. I was supposed to get all this extra help in school, and I was supposed to get this, and I didn't want any of it. I just wanted to play water polo and be one of the guys. And so in my mind, I never really had this disability. And until I realized, I'm actually limited from doing certain professions where it's required to have 100% of your hearing. So the program that I went through is called the Last House Recovery Community, and it's in West Los Angeles, and it's just an amazing place. And I function as the director of admissions for there, and I've held other positions within that company. And I was about 6 months, 6 months in the Last House, and there's this leadership training that happens there that I didn't know was happening at the time. That's what I love about this program, is that I didn't know I was getting better. It almost like I was just having fun and I was just doing the things that the guys were doing. And I had what's called a little brother, which is somebody who's new in the program, that, he was somebody that I had to look out for, and, the brother's keeper mentality. And I took him to get signed up for DUI school, because he had multiple DUIs. and I was on the vocational part of the program, which was really scary to me because I'd failed at every other job, and I had to have some, again, pushing through the uncomfortability of this belief that I have that if I get a job, I'm just going to lose it 6 months anyway. So what's even the point? Mm-hmm. And so I was signing this guy up for DUI school, and I asked him, I was like, "Are you guys hiring?" And they were like, "Actually, yeah, we are." And I wound up getting hired at this job, and I had the idea of working in recovery was not one, or in mental health or in this space was something I'd actually told myself I wasn't going to do. And then I got this job, working at this DUI school, and I was the first point of contact for people who had, the interventions had come from the judge. They had come from these were the people they were dealing with were lawyers, judges, cops. They came in pissed off, and here, we would just, get these people who were just really, really upset, and I had to de-escalate them. I was the first face they were seeing, the first phone call, and I learned, I had a boss there who taught me, a couple things, and, these were things that I actually had inside of me, and I didn't know I had them. I didn't really put names on them. One was to learn people's first names, right? And somebody comes in, "Joanna, there you are, so glad you made it," instantly, and that was one thing. Was to smile was the other, right? Instant diffuser. And the other thing was, he had this policy is we always help the client, or we remove barriers for clients, because everybody comes in with these and in life everybody has barriers and excuses that may not. So let me remove this barrier and let's help you. That's a barrier, let's remove that. And so I worked at that job, and I loved it, and it was dysfunctional and it was crazy, but again, I'm a lifeguard. I'm used to people drowning and all these other things, and I'm familiar with addiction because I'm in recovery now myself, and I loved it. And I got this opportunity then to work at the last house after I graduated the program, and I wasn't doing anything else at the time, and I really loved everybody there, and so I started working there, and I was just having some of the best times of my life, surfing again. I remember buying my first new surfboard, and that was such a huge deal for me. I was so proud of myself, and I remember a few months later I got off the family cell phone plan. And that was like, I remember the freedom that came from that. And I was like, oh my God, I'm free. And all of a sudden, all these options of life opened up. And it didn't matter that I didn't have a college education. I had self-esteem, and I had found, I'd begun to define some of the inherent values that I had. And so I ran with those, and I had really good teachers. I don't want to, I had really good teachers, both in the 12-step community and in the last house. I was really taught by some of the best. And I asked one day to go to a conference, because the founder, Clayton, couldn't go to a conference one day. And I went there, and I it was scary. I didn't know anybody, and I just did the things that I'd been taught, which is smile, use people's first names, and remove any barriers. And by the time Clayton got to the conference, everybody goes to him, and they say, "Oh, we met your new director of marketing, Chris." And all of a sudden, it was just, I was the director of marketing, working and we figured it out. And that DUI school asked me to come back and become a counselor. And so I got a counseling certificate, and I was working there. And I just felt so useful in the role as doing this outreach and finding treatment, and something that I really had a knack for and a skill for. So I just quit the counseling job and just started invoicing Clayton for 40 hours a week. And it just ran from there. And then I started, learning how to do interventions and seeking more education, and, and I got all these, and it's almost like all the, how I was saying in college, like I'm supposed to pick, and I was business, I was philosophy, I was psychology, and I think I wanted to do politics, political science. I know a little about a lot, right? And in the role I'm in now is I get to pick from all these things. And if I don't know something, I get to, read and learn and find out. And I still get to, work with young people who, have the same experience I have. And one of the things I was taught in this work, which I try to teach, other new people in it, is don't use your experience as your first line of defense, is get education, get tools to use, and as your last line of defense is when I use my experiences, maybe when I tell my story. And, just through, really simple things and kind of the next right actions, I'm in this great position where, I just got married 2 months ago. My wife and I just bought our first home, things that I just didn't think were possible. And I surf all the time. I love surfing, and I get to be a lifeguard, in a sense. I get to, I really feel like I get to save lives and have an effect on people, and pull people, rescue people who are drowning and I don't just get calls from just drug addicts. I've gotten more education in mental health and knowing where that person needs to be, and really building relationships. And it's I go back to all these things I that were there when I was younger. Like networking, how important it is to have a network and relationships. So that's where I'm at now.
So I'm going to ask you this question. You've just given actually some great advice, and I think you've also teed yourself up pretty well for answering this question. But do you see yourself as successful?
Oh man, I knew this question was coming and I don't have an answer, because I love the name of this podcast. Success is subjective. So yes, I do consider myself successful. And trying to look at this definition of success is, as children, the only definition of success we have is, I don't want to say comes from our parents, but, it
does. I think it does. It comes from what we see.
Yeah.
Right? Or what we're told or what we hear.
Yeah. In our peer group, and, I've been thinking about my story and the people, especially my mentors, and what do I think success looks like. And, I was just talking with Clayton about this, who's, one of my biggest mentors is, and for those who don't know, Clayton's the founder of The Last House. Clayton was actually the guy that picked me up from the airport when I didn't even have a day sober. And I got to look at, his principles and his values, and I've seen something in him that I've now developed myself, and I think is really important in success, and that's the ability to pivot. And, some of your other interviewees have talked about this, being able to pivot and being able to be, okay despite outside circumstances. And there's a wonderful speaker from the 12-step program that talks about emotional sobriety, and it's something that really doesn't just apply to sobriety in the sense of substance use, and being emotionally sober is when my view of myself matches the view of everyone, the external view that others have of me. And it sounds weird at the beginning, but when I really look at my own experiences, I had the hardest time taking compliments. In fact, when my first boss, he told me, the one at the DUI school, he says, "Chris, anytime you get a compliment, all you're allowed to say is thank you. And you grit your teeth and you smile." Because I would, somebody would give me a compliment. I'd say, "Oh no, it was just it's no big deal," or whatever, because my inside didn't match the view of others' view of me. So all these people on the outside, if you ask anybody, oh, Chris is this great guy, he's super friendly, but my inside didn't match that. And I think, some semblance of, I don't know if we'd call it homeostasis in our environment, I think is something that's really pivotal to success.
Okay, so I'm going to follow it up. Because of the work that you do, you really are the lifeguard, right? You're directing people. So somebody's calling, right, a parent because they are worried about their young adult. What do you feel like is probably the most common thing that you're actually telling? I'm flipping the script so it's not even young adults. What advice are you giving the parent who's dealing with the young adult that's struggling?
Okay, so there's something I always say to parents, and it's actually become a mantra of our program, and our program director now uses it all. I love hearing people say things I come up with, and it's that the struggle is the journey, and the struggle is so important in the journey, because a lot of people say, the journey is the destination, and I say the struggle is the journey.
I think that applies to young adults and parents. Right? Like we're saying who's calling, saying, how do I handle this? I like that mantra. I like that a lot.
Thank you. Because if I could, that's I want to say so much, and if I could sum it up into that, and it's just, this, idea that of being flexible and limber and being able to change my views when presented with new information, and not to hold on to these beliefs, whether they're core beliefs that are, instilled in me in childhood, or whether they're just beliefs about the way the world works or how people are. And I love being surprised. I love being proven wrong. I love new information, and that might just be me. And I see, when I see successful people, I go back to, this being able to pivot, right? Being able to pivot my beliefs and being able to pivot just in any circumstance.
So we're going to pivot here, and we're actually going to wrap up, because I think we could probably sit here and continue to talk about this topic.
I love talking about
like
this stuff.
8
You and I
hours.
totally could. We totally could.
And maybe we'll have a Convo 2.0 down the line. But for right now, I think what's important is people need to know how to reach you, because they either want to connect with you from your own experience, right? Here's this piece of service, right? Like if somebody reaches out to you, you want to connect, or if they're just curious about the last house, right? How do they connect with you?
So, one of the best ways to connect these days is always through the internet. So thelasthouse.net is our website. And, calling me, my number's on there. I'm very easy to find. I'm very visible. I have a mustache. I'm the guy in the pictures with the mustache. And it's,
I can attest. The mustache is alive and well right now.
And so, I also really encourage every family that calls me, I encourage them to look at our social media, because our guys really play a part in that social media. And it's so hard to tell somebody about the program and the experience, and it's something it has to be experienced, and it's something that's so real and concrete to me. But when I verbalize it, it sounds like this abstract idea and this abstract kind of route to success. And so I really, get on Instagram and get on Facebook and connect with us on The Last House. We love to interact with families, and, always just, free advice. I'm happy to take a call from it. I love, taking calls from people and just, being that lifeguard.
Oh, and just mic drop. We'll make sure that we have all the links in the show notes. So definitely connect with The Last House. Definitely connect with Chris. And Chris, thanks for taking the time to chat with me.
Thank you for having me, Joanna.
That's it for this week's Success is Subjective episode. I want to thank my guests for joining me on this week and for being willing to share your journey. This podcast would not exist if it weren't for people such as yourself. Stay tuned for our next episode, where you can bet it'll be another amazing human sharing their personal story with the world. Make sure you check out the show notes where you will find contact information, website details, and all social media for our guest. Also, put a face with a voice by accessing their interview on the newly formed successissubjective.org website. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, you can email me at Joanna, Joanna, at successissubjective.org. I would also be remiss if I didn't tell you to check out the collegealternative.org and lilyconsulting.com websites for additional resources outside of podcasting. If you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, please do me a favor and subscribe. And while you're at it, feel free to leave a review. You can also download to listen to the Success is Subjective podcast on any other podcast playing app, such as Audible, Google, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. Last but not least, Success is Subjective is listener supported, made possible by me and by you. You can support this podcast by joining the Patreon community at patreon.com/successissubjective. Thank you for tuning in. And remember, there is no single path through life. Success is what you make it.